When it comes to JRPGs, Final Fantasy has always been at the forefront. Last time we examined the original Final Fantasy and the foundation it laid for the future of the series. That future would be literally filled with change and evolution. The precedent of disconnected titles begins immediately, with the second entry untethered from the first in narrative and even some gameplay elements. This would go on to become a defining feature of the entire series, but it started here. Few hold Final Fantasy II in high regard, with the game often propping up the bottom of best to worst Final Fantasy lists. But is it actually a bad game? Or did the prolonged period of Japan exclusivity force it into poor comparisons with future titles that players experienced first? Taking a closer look with fresh eyes, I aim to find an answer to these questions and see if Final Fantasy II holds up in the modern era as I continue playing through the Final Fantasy series from the top. Much like the previous game, our story begins with the Japanese release of Final Fantasy II, once again for Nintendo's Famicom, in 1988. And there it stayed, for over a decade. In 1990, the game was considered for translation and international release, with a prototype produced under the name Dark Shadow over Palakia. Unfortunately, this process never moved beyond the transcription phase, being dropped in favour of focusing efforts on Final Fantasy IV, which would end up being released as Final Fantasy II in the West. Nice and confusing. To simplify, if you played a Final Fantasy II in the 90s on the Super Nintendo, it was not this one. This Final Fantasy II was first seen outside of Japan in 2003, alongside the first game in Final Fantasy Origins. Like its compatriot, Final Fantasy II received a range of upgrades to both the audio and visuals. The Origins release of Final Fantasy II included an easy mode as well, though it is less controversial than that of the first game, mainly because the main changes were 3 optional features. This release tweaked some levelling formulas, and also fixed some bugs, but not all of them. A year later, Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls was released for the Game Boy Advance. For Final Fantasy II, there were fewer fundamental changes than 1, but still some that are noteworthy beyond the expected reduction in sound and graphics. Character avatars were added for all named NPCs, a seemingly small change, but one that gives characters quite a bit more substance. The inventory system was tweaked, as was the stat levelling system. These changes make the game slightly easier, but are counterbalanced by the removal of one bug whose abuse made the game rather trivial. Finally, fitting with the Souls theme, alongside the first game's Soul of Chaos, Final Fantasy II gets the Soul of Rebirth. Rather than optional dungeons though, this is a post-game side story that can be a decent challenge. The PSP got its own version of Final Fantasy II in 2007, once again getting another round of graphical and audio updates, and similar to Final Fantasy I's release on the console, also getting additional bonus content in the form of the Arcane Labyrinths. These dungeons feature a method of progression that utilises one of the quirkier aspects of Final Fantasy II's gameplay, which we will cover later. Rounding out Final Fantasy II's releases, we have the Android and iOS versions. Based on the PSP version, but with touch-friendly interfaces, these games inherit many of the problems that Final Fantasy I featured on the same devices. A low internal resolution and a high incidence of game-crashing bugs give these releases some very mixed reviews. I once again chose the PSP for the full game playthrough, and I sampled the PS1 and GBA versions. Given the lack of an official release of Final Fantasy II for the NES, I did not investigate it in too much depth. By all accounts, the PS1 version isn't that different beyond the presentation, but any significant changes will be mentioned when relevant. Let's jump to the usual starting point, the gameplay. In the broadest sense, the core gameplay loop of Final Fantasy II is identical to that of its predecessor. You explore the overworld, visiting towns and dungeons, talking with NPCs and buying items, routinely encountering monsters and engaging them in turn-based battles. The devil lies in the details though, and on close inspection, Final Fantasy II brings plenty of changes to the formula, many of which are unique to this game, which may give some indication as to how successful these changes were. We'll find out as we examine the battle system of Final Fantasy II. There are plenty of unchanged features and mechanics, such as recoloured sprites indicating enemy variations, so if I don't mention something, assume it to be mostly unchanged. The first change is obvious upon entering a battle and seeing the combatants. While the basic layout remains, it is no longer a simple representation of who is fighting. The row system started here. Your party members can be placed in the front or back row from the menu, though may move automatically under certain conditions. The enemies also have their own rows. With the maximum number of enemies reduced to 8, they form up to 4 rows of 2, with the 2 nearest rows being considered the front row and the remainder the back row. What does this mean? Well, the back rows of each side cannot be targeted with physical attacks, but cannot attack themselves unless armed with a bow or by casting magic spells. Once the front row has fallen, the back row becomes the front row and can be targeted with all attacks. On the face of it, this sounds quite useful, keeping vulnerable characters out of harm's way. However, this isn't necessarily a good idea in this particular title, given the way the levelling system works. As for the enemies themselves, we start to see a few more of the recurring Final Fantasy monsters here, such as the Bomb and Marlborough lines, with a few of the original game's Dungeons & Dragons inspired monsters being sidelined or redesigned. Elemental affinities start to become a little more prolific, though there are few cases where it actually changes your actions. Regarding those actions, many are the same as the last game. Attack remains the simple physical attack with the equipped weapon or weapons. That's the only major change. Characters can now equip a weapon or shield in each hand. Different combinations have different effects on damage output, and dual wielding isn't just a straight doubling of damage. Shields can also play an important role. Characters will level their proficiency with each type of weapon, so you need to be slightly more aware of what is equipped. The lack of auto-targeting was still a feature in the Famicom version, once again becoming optional, then mandatory for the respective Origins and Dawn of Souls releases. Magic once again allows you to cast spells. In all versions of this game, MP is used as the resource for casting spells. The spells themselves will get an in-depth explanation later, as they are actually tied into the levelling system in many ways. Flee returns, based upon the character's agility rather than a luck stat, with randomness still a factor, and some encounters, especially bosses, being impossible to escape. Equip and items share the same function, using items and changing equipment, with slight version differences. Origins and earlier only allowed you to use items such as potions in battle if they had been equipped by the character. Each character has 2 slots available for items or spare equipment. Later versions allowed you to use any item in the shared inventory, with equipment also being changeable from the same menu. Defend returns in the PSP version, but wasn't present in earlier releases. it has the same function. So, your actions are mostly the same as before. What about enemy actions? First, the enemy will check to see if it flees. This uses a random number checked against the fear rating of the monster. Fear is based on a predefined value for each monster that is affected by the difference in HP from your party to the monster, and may be increased by the use of the fear spell. If the enemy doesn't flee, it moves on to selecting an action. Every monster may have up to 8 options, such as physical attack, spells or skills, each with their own percentage weight. A random number is used to determine which option is used, with unusable options such as spells that require more MP than the monster has left being ignored. It should be noted, if none of the options can be used, the monster will default to a physical attack even if it was not an original option, and if the monster is out of range for a physical attack, they will then do nothing. Turn order is once again semi-random, but in a more balanced way than it was in the first Final Fantasy. This time around, agility, or more specifically evasion chance, has a clear noticeable effect. A random number is added to the evasion chance of the combatant, then all combatants are placed in order. Therefore, there is not necessarily a guarantee of acting first, but you can at least have a rough idea, and you don't get automatically penalised by the randomisation method. You may be wondering why it is the evasion chance that is used for turn order calculations. Seems like an appropriate moment to segue into talking about stats. This time, characters have 6 core stats: strength, agility, spirit, intelligence, stamina, and magic. These stats are raised with the levelling system, which will be covered in depth later. These stats affect a variety of things. Some of them are used in combat by themselves, others are combined with equipment to produce the combat stats: attack, accuracy, defense, evasion, and magic defense. So far, so similar. Strength affects attack like last time, but also your accuracy. Agility affects your evasion chance. Spirit affects white magic's power and its accuracy, a hidden stat that uses certain values of each individual spell when calculated, so is not shown to the player as it varies so much. Intelligence is the black magic counterpart to spirit, working in the same way. Stamina is the amount of HP gained when HP increases, while magic provides the same function for MP. Both of these affect magic defense. Attack works as it did before, using strength and the current weapon's attack rating. Accuracy has 2 factors. The first number is the amount of hits attempted and is determined by your proficiency with the current weapon, while the percentage is the actual chance for each hit to connect, based on the weapon accuracy and your strength stat. Defense once again reduces damage taken and is based on equipped armour. Evasion is in many ways the mirror of accuracy. The first number is how many chances you get to evade hits, and rises naturally as you are targeted by enemies. This we will call evasion rate. The percentage is the actual chance of avoiding a hit, hence we're calling it evasion chance. It is also used for turn order and running from battle. This makes more sense if you consider evasion chance to be the adjusted agility, as it is calculated by taking your agility and combining it with the evasion statistics of equipment, then subtracting the armour weight. Magic defense works like evasion, but for spells. The first number is again chances to avoid the hits, while the percentage is the actual likelihood of avoiding each hit. The chances grow naturally as you are targeted by magic, while the percentage uses your stamina, magic, and equipped armour's magic defense rating. HP and MP work exactly like they did last time. At this point, like the game, we break from the format established last time, and we'll now talk about levelling, as it is not connected to the characters or any classes. In fact, characters themselves don't actually have levels or classes. Stats grow on an individual basis depending on how you approach combat. It's certainly worth a closer look. The levelling system of Final Fantasy II is simple in some ways and complicated in others. The brief version: the more you do a specific action in combat, the stronger you will become at that action. Practice makes perfect, in essence. Pretty simple until you look at how different aspects increase. First off, the easy part: weapons and spells. Yeah, your weapons and spells actually level up in this game. These work on the principle of gaining 100 progress points to increase by 1 level. Sounds like it would be easy to grind even without abusing the system, and believe me, the system is very easy to abuse. But that is where the enemy rank and your weapon or spell level comes into play. The actual formula has slightly different modifiers on each version, but the core formula is always enemy formation rank minus skill level plus number of uses. If this number is positive, you earn that much progress, with a certain bonus on some versions, towards the weapon proficiency or the spell level. Typically, spells have larger modifiers, as there are more spells than weapon types, so an individual spell may earn progress more quickly than a weapon type for the same number of uses. If the result of the formula is negative or 0, you get no progress at all. In practice, this means that facing tougher enemies will give you more rapid progress, but fighting weaker monsters may be a waste of time, unless you abuse the system. There are 8 weapon proficiencies, most of which work in the same way. Bows can be used from the back row, while shields contribute towards evasion. When you earn progress, you advance the item type of each hand equally, so dual wielding 2 weapons of the same type will, if you actually earn progress, give you double that progress, while wielding a sword and shield will give progress to each. For magic, there are 40 spells available, though each character can only have 16 at any one time, which on the face is less than the previous instalment. However, as each spell has its own individual level, and all spells can single or multi-target, there are actually more spell effects than last time. That individual spell level can cause issues though. Support and status spells are often useless until they are at least level 4 or even higher, regularly failing completely. One of the more aggravating aspects of this is the spells Esuna and Basuna. Each is for healing different status ailments. Their problem is that they need to be at certain levels to even have a chance of healing certain ailments. If you have rarely used them, and suddenly come to a point where you need them, they are too weak to actually do anything, so you may find yourself having to grind for a protracted amount of time just to get them to a functional level. Weapons and spells are the only aspects that use the basic formula. Evasion rate, the number of attacks you get a chance to dodge, increases in a similar way, though it uses the number of times you are targeted by a physical attack. This is tougher to keep track of, as the status screen doesn't show evasion progress. Magic defense works in this way too, though obviously is based on being targeted by a magical spell. Its progress is also hidden from the player. In theory, there are 16 levels for these skills, and each weapon and each spell. However, enemy rank caps out at 7, so trying to increase beyond level 10 becomes very difficult, especially for weapons or damaging spells, unless you abuse the system. More on that soon. Magic also has an interesting property in that the MP cost of a spell is the same as that spell's level. so as your spells become stronger, they cost more to cast. MP and HP increase in the same way, except in later versions HP is also given as a bonus for every 10 battles the character survives. Their natural method of progression is based upon how much was used in a battle. So if you take a large amount of damage in a battle, you have a high chance of getting a HP increase. Likewise, casting a lot of spells will make it more likely that you will gain MP. It sounds like a reasonable system, and it works well early in the game. The cracks become very visible in the mid-game though. The problematic factor is that you have to lose or use at least an eighth of your maximum HP or MP to even have a chance of an increase. Granted, this is less of a problem with HP, as enemies will gradually hit you harder as you progress, so it stays reasonably balanced. MP is the major issue. By the time you have about 150 MP, you are usually capable of finishing most fights in just a couple of rounds. But this means you are only using 10 to 15 MP, which is not enough to trigger even a chance of an increase, which then means that in dungeons you end up running out of MP, or forcing yourself to conserve it in order to have some for the bosses. While you can use ethers in some versions, it doesn't change the fact that after a certain point in the game you must dedicate some time specifically to increasing your MP, as many spells will still be advancing and increasing in cost. If it worked on a more global level, where the total amount of MP you had ever used was measured against certain milestones that then triggered an increase, the system would be far less egregious. This way you still follow the theme of practice makes perfect without forcing the player to engage in the abject tedium of grinding. As it stands, you are effectively punished for playing efficiently. Our final aspect of levelling is the basic stats. The general concept is still the same. In order to have a chance of increasing a stat, you need to make use of that stat in battle. The 3 action stats, strength, intelligence and spirit, all seem to work in the same way. The more times you use a relevant action in a battle, such as attacking for strength or casting black magic for intelligence, the more likely that stat is to increase at the end of the battle. I wasn't able to find hard data on the exact margins where the chance of growing increases, and the rank of the enemy formation may play a role, but without concrete information I can't tell you for certain. Magic and stamina also work in the same way as each other and use HP and MP loss as their triggers for potential growth, linking them closely with HP and MP increases. Often, though not always, an increase in MP will be joined by an increase in magic, likewise for HP and stamina. Agility is an outlier and less is understood about how it increases. It is heavily linked with evasion chance, despite evasion chance itself being reliant on agility. If your evasion chance after weapon bonuses and armour reductions is too low, you will not actually have a chance to gain agility, which then means your evasion chance doesn't increase and you end up stuck being slow and an open target. Shields provide a large evasion chance boost, so a common piece of advice, especially through the early game, is to make sure everyone is equipped with a shield alongside their preferred weapon. This will allow you to gain plenty of agility, and therefore boost evasion chance, which feeds back into itself. It should be noted that in early versions, some stats can actually decay as well. Whenever you gain a point of strength, intelligence or spirit, you have a chance of losing a point of intelligence, stamina or strength respectively. You can abuse this by levelling spirit, then strength, then intelligence, then stamina. That way, any losses don't affect stats you've already raised. Abusing the system has come up a number of times. In many ways, it is almost required at times, like with MP or trying to get a weak spell up to a functional level. The main methods all follow a similar pattern. First off, find an encounter where you aren't too concerned by the enemies, but said enemies also won't flee from the fight. Then target yourself, over and over again. Doing this with physical attacks will raise strength and weapon level, and HP if the target finishes the battle with low enough HP. On the magic front, you can target each other with damage spells, or the enemy for status moves. Spend enough time and you'll use enough MP to increase that too. That's the key though, time. It takes a long time to significantly increase stats and skills this way. And it's even worse with spells and MP, as low level spells only use 1 or 2 MP per casting, so you have to spend ages using weak spells, hope you've reached the next level with them, then cast other spells to use up MP so that you get a boost in that. There are some workarounds. Sap and Osmose spells reduce the target's MP, so you can use them to quickly drop one character's MP and help them gain more after the battle. And you can set up combos, having one character attack another while somebody heals the target, and another spams random magic into the void. It doesn't change the fact that it will still take time to grind it out, time where you will not be engaged in the slightest, and is still abusing the mechanics of the game for an advantage which some would consider to be cheating. The other version of abuse doesn't even operate within the intended mechanics. I mentioned at the start of the video a certain bug. The action cancelling bug turns the PS1 version into a trivial exercise if you take advantage of it too much. It was removed for later releases. The way it works is fairly simple. The number of uses is increased by 1 whenever you command a character to attack or use a certain spell. The abuse comes by cancelling that action, hence the name of the bug. Cancelling an action does not remove the increased uses, so you can assign actions to each of the first 3 characters, then before selecting one for your 4th character, you simply cancel all previous actions and start again. And by setting the cursor to memory, you can essentially tap confirm a few times, then tap back a few times, then tap confirm a few times again. Once you find the rhythm, you can easily rack up a full level in just a few minutes, as animations don't even have to play. Within an hour, you can potentially have a grossly overpowered team. The only potential downside of this is that your 4th character doesn't get to go through any of this. They would just have to go through naturally. Except that isn't actually much of a downside. Let's meet the cast. At the start of the game, you get to name your 4 characters, though they do actually now have canon names: Thirion, Maria, Guy and Leon. Given the nature of the levelling system being very freeform, these characters don't actually have a predefined class, though they do have very slight initial differences that can point them towards certain roles if you want a couple of points head start on the stats. Thirion starts out with the most balanced stats and can be easily shaped into whatever role you want him to play. Maria has reduced strength and stamina, but high agility and intelligence, the stat for black magic, giving her an edge if you push in the black mage direction. Guy is essentially the opposite, high strength and stamina with low agility and intelligence. He clearly leans into the warrior class. All 3 of them have the same amount of spirit, so any of them can cover the role of white mage, though Maria may want her MP for black magic. We didn't talk about Leon, did we? That is because almost immediately after starting the game, Leon disappears. That's right, for most of the game you only have 3 main characters. The 4th party slot is occasionally filled by a series of guest characters who pop in and out according to the needs of the story. This is why the action cancelling bug has so little downside. The 4th character, who doesn't get boosted, is soon replaced anyway. Most guest characters come with a preset build that points them towards specific roles, though obviously, with the nature of the levelling system, you can change them slightly. Minwu comes with a wide range of white magic spells and stats that reinforce that role. As the first guest character, a white mage is extremely helpful, though if you aren't aware of the rotating nature of the slot, you may be disappointed when your healer suddenly wanders off. Joseph joins you next, falling comfortably into the monk class, with a few levels of proficiency in unarmed combat and high strength and agility to assist. He helps provide some damage output during his time with the party. Gordon is similar to Firion, well balanced in stats, with no particular proficiency. You can shape him into whatever role you feel you need at that moment in time. Layla is a straight up pirate and clearly leans into the thief class. With high agility, some proficiency with daggers and swords, she also starts with the Thunder elemental spell, giving you another clear option for her. Rickard Highwind, last of the Dragoons, would go on to be inspiration for a recurring class in the series. Here he has high strength and good proficiency in swords and spears, but is lacking on the magical side. The final guest character, who is something of a spoiler so will remain unnamed, joins the party with a wide range of skills. They have some proficiency with most weapon types, though swords, axes and spears are the highest three. On the stat front, strength is high, as is agility, and intelligence has a reasonable foundation if you want some more black magic for the final stages of the game. From a gameplay standpoint, I actually don't mind the rotating cast. It helps to show off various builds that you can aim your main trio towards, letting you get a feel for how they work. If anything, it could have been utilised to a greater degree, as there is no black mage equivalent of Minwu, which is a shame as it would be nice to experience some high level supporting black magic without having to grind everything up yourself. The downside is that some characters, at least on the PSP version, were weaker than the trio when they arrived and required some grinding to get them up to speed. And while you can always use the levelling system to push them towards roles that synergise with your existing party members, it will take time grinding, which is doubly painful when those characters leave the party and that time has been truly wasted. All in all, the basics of the combat system are actually pretty solid. The minor tweaks from the first game make things work a bit smoother at times. The levelling does end up being a problem though. The concept is great. There's a very successful series that uses a similar concept, and when they can release the same game enough times for it to become a meme, you know that the mechanics can work well. The execution is the problem. Early game, it's really good and helps you feel invested in the characters almost more than the plot does, but as you get towards the middle of the game, it starts to falter and the inadequacies begin to stand out. While many basic skills progress at a natural pace as you advance to new areas, there are some that require such specific grinding that it becomes a genuine chore. Trying to get some lesser used spells up to usable level was so dull I was literally dozing off. It got to the point where I gave up on them and just went with the easier method of just hitting harder. The fact that some spells are intentionally almost non-functional at low levels is a particularly foolish design choice. Perhaps a guest character with decent levelled black magic would have shown what they can do and given incentive to level the spells, but as it stands, when your level 4 spells still do nothing against some of the weakest enemies, the average player is likely to just stop bothering with said spells, especially when you can see that throwing a lightning bolt or stabbing with a knife actually does something. I wanted to like the system. The idea is good, but the developers missed the ball here, and I can't honestly recommend something that literally put me to sleep. On which note, let's move on to the world design before you all get so bored that you fall asleep. The world of Final Fantasy II is unnamed, and it isn't even given a token name by a different game. 3 main continents make up the majority of the landmass, with a reasonably varied selection of environments for you to explore. Navigating can be a little tricky at first, especially when you unlock the boat, as there is only one entrance to the inner sea, which is quite easy to miss. Once you get used to using the map, you can start to make more sense of things, and you should eventually figure out the best ways to get somewhere. We don't get as much of that transport-based soft gatekeeping in this game, and what we did get seems to be geared more towards story concerns than difficulty. Even at the start of the game, you can be innocently exploring your confines and wander a bit too far to the left. There isn't anything preventing you from heading out that way, no rivers or ocean, no broken bridge. You're walking along, thinking the starting area is quite large, when you cross an invisible boundary and get set upon by a pack of werewolves, who quite eagerly tear your party a new one. And if you forgot to save, thinking you were still in a friendly starting area, a new game too. On the one hand, it certainly serves to make you more wary of the world and its dangers. On the other, it just feels a bit harsh to be punished for ignoring the plot for a while to explore the nearby area. All the transportation options from Final Fantasy return, though some of them function slightly differently, along with a couple of new means of travel. The canoe works as it did before, letting you cross rivers and lakes. The ship comes in 2 forms. The first you don't actually own or pilot, it merely acts as a ferry service between 2 early towns, which you can actually walk between anyway. Later on, once you meet Layla the pirate, she gives you command of her ship and you can freely explore the seas. The big change from Final Fantasy's ship is that you can dock anywhere you like. No more combing the coast for a port, you just move up to a piece of ground that your characters can walk on and they happily disembark. The airship also makes a return, and like the regular ship, starts out mainly as a taxi service. It's a bit limited, you can only fly from one town, and once dropped off at the destination of your choice, Cid, yes, the first Cid of the series, will basically abandon you there. Eventually he does give you control of the airship, leaving you free to fly across the world, but it is very late in the game, so most of the time you are limited to ground-based travel. Landing restrictions remain the same, but the world design is far more accommodating most of the time. The first new piece of transport is the snowcraft. Effectively a sail strapped to a pair of skis. This is essentially used as a means of preventing you from heading into the snowfield before the plot wants you to. It can't even be used anywhere else, so it does feel very arbitrary. The last method of transport is rather special. Limited to just one starting location, and fairly well hidden at that, we have the series introduction of that big yellow chicken that everybody loves, the Chocobo. Acting like a dash for the overworld, riding a Chocobo is much faster than walking, and also avoids random battles. Once you jump off though, like Cid, the Chocobo will abandon you and go home. If you do pass close to the Chocobo forest, it's worth grabbing one, but is sadly also not worth going out of your way for either. The biggest issue with the overworld is the fact that you spend so much of the game traipsing back and forth across the same areas. Whether it's on foot in the early game or on the ship going between various islands and the initial town, you have to go over the same stretch of forest or the same sea strait so often that they start to become dull. It should be noted that this is less a fault of the world design than it is the story design, but perhaps more could have been done with the world design to make such journeys more interesting or, at the very least, swifter. Final Fantasy II actually has fewer towns than the first outing, but given the nature of the plot and how the story plays out, it actually works out reasonably well. Each town feels distinct, perhaps even more so than in the first game, and there is often more than a single thing to do in each town. Between the pubs and some NPCs actually having houses for you to visit, towns feel that little bit more real, rather than the town being a few shops and a bunch of residents just roaming the streets. It's an understandable abstraction, but actually seeing NPCs with homes makes the towns more grounded. Another key feature is that the towns will actually change through the course of the game. After certain story events occur, the array of NPCs may change, and the lines they give you will likely be different. So, in effect, while 2 has fewer towns, there is more content to be had from said towns. As for services, this is pretty much the same as the first game, with a few minor tweaks. Sanctuaries no longer charge you for resurrection. Black and white magic shops have been combined. Weapon and armour shops remain unchanged, though general goods now have 3 counters, with a greater selection of goods available right from the start of the game, though you may not have the gil to afford some of them until later on. Finally, inns return, though this time the charge is based upon how much HP and MP you need to recover, rather than the differing flat rates of Final Fantasy's various towns. Inns are also no longer required for saving the game. Even on the earliest versions, the only restriction on saving is that it must be done on the overworld, so you no longer have to find an inn or go camping. Dawn of Souls onwards follows the same pattern of the previous game though, allowing you to save anywhere, even in dungeons. Before I talk about the dungeons, I'll wrap up my thoughts on the non-dungeon world design, as dungeons have got enough going on by themselves. The actual world map is in a vacuum pretty good. Once you figure out how best to navigate around it, it sits pretty much on par with World A. The towns are a big improvement. The fact they change even slightly with the story really helps give the world a sense of being alive. Ironically, the dungeons may sap your will to live. Let's start with the positives. Mainly, all my problems with the dungeons in Final Fantasy I seem to have been addressed here. Dungeon floors are more compact, with a similar active area, but a smaller total footprint. They sprawl out a lot less, giving you a view of nearby areas, such as a tantalising glimpse of a treasure chest, or even the stairs to the next floor. While dead ends still exist, almost all of them contain something of value, so you don't feel cheated out of your time. The eternally repeating fixed encounter tiles have also been dismissed. It's almost impressive how they fixed all these problems in just one iteration. It's even more impressive that they managed to introduce fresh new hells. First off, the encounter rate is, or at least feels, way too high. This may be because I played mostly the PSP version of Final Fantasy I, but once fixed encounters were taken out of the equation, I personally felt like there were far more random encounters in Final Fantasy II. I may be totally wrong about the actual rate, it may have just felt like more because I knew there was no benefit to engaging in most battles, given the way the levelling system works. After your first few fights in a new dungeon, your party's main skills will once more be pretty much at the level where dedicated grinding is necessary to go higher. So you get stuck with the choice of trying to go through as quick as you can, with most encounters giving you no benefit, or trying to level up some weaker spells and skills, which takes twice as long and reinforces how weak the low level spells are. The length of the dungeons certainly doesn't help. 3 to 5 floors was the general rule of thumb from Final Fantasy I, and it seemed about right. That only applies to the early game here. Later dungeons are 7, 8, even 10 floors for the final dungeon, which is really 16 floors because you have to go through a 6th floor dungeon first. And remember, on early versions you can't save in the dungeons, so losing a fight means going through the whole hour and a quarter plus ordeal all over again. We aren't even at the worst bit. Time to introduce, quite possibly, the stupidest idea ever implemented en masse in a single game. The monster closets. They appear in almost every dungeon multiple times, and every single time they are infuriating. From the outside, they have the same appearance as the doors to treasure rooms. In fact, they usually use the same interior sprites. Except there is no treasure. You are also deposited 2 steps into the room, so you can't simply turn on your heels and be out of there with just a few seconds wasted. You have to cross those 2 steps. What I haven't mentioned is how high the encounter rate in these rooms is, somewhere in the order of 50% per tile, which means you have a 1 in 4 chance of escaping unmolested. Half the time you'll have to fight 1 battle, and the last quarter of your experiences in these rooms will be 2 battles, if you don't accidentally take an extra step. In which case, be very careful, because you might just roll your eyes so hard it hurts when you enter your 3rd or 4th encounter in one tiny room. Any one of these wouldn't be a deal breaker. Well, maybe the monster closets. The trouble is, the combination serves to make dungeons something you just don't want to play through, not because of difficulty or tension, but because they are boring. When you have long dungeons with lots of encounters that hardly require your attention and don't offer you any benefit, and even exploring for treasure is actively punished, you just switch off. The only thing that kept me going was at the end of most dungeons you get some story. This is where we get the biggest change from Final Fantasy I. There is actually a story with actual characters that feels like a narrative rather than a series of objectives. The game also introduces a rudimentary dialogue system where you can learn keywords from characters and then use the keywords to potentially unlock new lines from different characters. It's not perfectly implemented, you need to manually learn the keywords, many of which are required to move the plot forward, so if you forget to learn a word and head to the next plot point, you may have to go all the way back to learn the keyword and then travel to your next objective again. There isn't really any logical reason as to why you have to manually learn the keywords, and if it was up to me, I would have made it automatic. Keywords are also the method of progression in the PSP's Arcane Labyrinths. Each keyword generates a different floor in each labyrinth, ending with a boss monster whose difficulty supposedly depends upon the terms used throughout the journey. It's certainly an interesting way of using an existing system in a new way. The Arcane Labyrinths even have their own mini-story, accessed after completing each of the 3 main labyrinths, which fleshes out their purpose. On that note, let's look at the story of the main game. I will be talking about some spoilers, so if you want to remain clear, skip ahead. While today the story is not especially deep, the game was first released in the 8-bit generation, where even storage for text was limited. For 1988, this may be one of the most story-rich games I've heard of. Many of the characters are quite well fleshed out, and if anything, the player's main trio are some of the weakest in this regard, though I think this may be due to the thematic implications of the game mechanics, with player choice being so important in combat, yet difficult or even impossible to actually implement in the narrative in 1988, it may have been seen as conflicting if during story scenes the characters don't act how the player envisions, so the simplest workaround is to have them say very little. It is minor, and they do still have arcs, such as Firion starting the game eager to join the rebellion, and being weary by the end, which, given the dungeon issues, I can certainly identify with. It's some of the NPCs and guest characters that stand out the most in this regard. Hilda, initially reluctant to allow the party to fight in the war, gradually comes to rely on them, while Gordon is one of the standouts, going from being unconfident and frankly a bit of a wimp, to being determined to do something, and eventually growing into a competent leader alongside Hilda. The main antagonist is sadly less well fleshed out. The Emperor, much like the fiends from the first game, seems to be mostly evil for evil's sake. He wants to rule the world and has summoned the forces of hell to do so. No reason is given for why he wants to rule the world, he just does. The minor villains have a bit more about them. The Dark Knight is the Emperor's powerful and mysterious number 2, with a really rather obvious connection to the party, while Borgen is the simpering weasel type, Ambitious, but ultimately a coward, and the kind of character that you can't wait to have the opportunity to fight. The core plot is pretty solid as far as early gaming stories go. The game opens with the aftermath of the Emperor's attack on Fynn, as the party flees for their lives but is run down by the Emperor's Death Riders. This may actually be one of the first examples in gaming of the unwinnable fight. And it doesn't give you any hope of actually winning like some games do. Your party is quite promptly slaughtered. Recovered by members of the rebellion, the party are healed by Minwu and proceed to ask Hilda to join the rebellion, but are initially refused. After sneaking back to Fynn, they find a wounded Scott, Gordon's brother, who gives them his ring and some information that convinces Hilda to let them help the rebellion. The party proceeds to perform various missions for the rebellion, such as finding a source of mithril, sabotaging the dreadnought, trying to recruit the dragoons, and more, all culminating in an attack against the Emperor himself, killing him. Before the celebrations get too overboard though, news comes that the Dark Knight, who is in fact Leon, has claimed the Empire, so the party must go and face him at the capital. They reach him, but before they actually fight, the Emperor rises, having literally taken over Hell, and pulls Pandemonium, the Palace of Hell, into the world. Annoyed by this, Leon joins the party for the final mission to find a way into Pandemonium and defeat the Emperor once and for all. I enjoyed it. There's plenty of character moments in amongst this, and while some plot points are pretty obvious, they are still good motivation for playing because you want to find out what happens when the truth is revealed. Obviously, it lacks the depth of many later entries, and there are quite a lot of elements that in today's games would seem cliché, but considering it in its own time, it is a remarkable piece of gaming storytelling. The biggest help in this regard is the fact that even the earliest versions included in-engine cutscenes, so story events can actually play out before your eyes, rather than just being told with pure text boxes or the dreaded text scroll. Later releases do feature some extra scenes to flesh things out, but many key plot points were present, particularly most character deaths, which brings us nicely to the Soul of Rebirth. This bonus story takes place at the same time as the main game's final mission, and stars a party of characters who all fell in the main story. It's not exactly critical to the story, but it's a fun little addition that brings a bit more to the characters and gives them some more closure. The biggest problem with the story is the same one that affects the overworld. With the party going out on missions for the rebellion, they often have to return to the rebel headquarters to progress things. And this generally means travelling back across the same areas every time. A few changes to the story might have helped, maybe giving us some rebel cells that can be points of contact for some missions, or have Sid and his airship more involved, or providing an expanded taxi service to let you skip some of the tedium. For the biggest problem, it is fairly minor. Overall, the story is definitely a positive for this game. Our final section, like last time, is presentation. I'll mention a few things about the Famicom version here, as it does bring some changes to the general formula that continued into future releases. The battle interface received a few changes, mostly in aesthetic rather than function, with the party and monsters appearing in the same plane and various bits of information moved about to make better use of screen space. It still has some issues with text box pop-in, and multi-targeting does still need to register on each target, so it can be just as slow, but it is a lot easier to look at. Shops and other buildings can also be entered properly this time, rather than just being a counter in the void. The inventory is now shared, though it is limited in capacity because of the limitations of save file size. The equipment interface is also closer to the SNES games, with each hand and armour piece having an individual slot. This is clearly the first jump towards what many would call the classic Final Fantasy formula. Visuals are barely changed from the first game, though that is hardly surprising as there was very little more that could be done with the Famicom. Sound is similarly still chip-based. There are fewer iconic tracks here, which may be sequel syndrome, where you're more likely to notice that which you've already heard, or may be down to its limited release. Without a global audience, it is less likely to be referenced elsewhere. The most recognisable tune is of course the Chocobo theme, which has been the basis for the Big Birds theme in most of their appearances. The remaining aspects of presentation are mostly a rehash of last episode. The PS1 brings visuals and interfaces in line with the SNES games, while recreating the soundtrack in higher quality. It adds a few cutscenes without changing the overall story. It also increases inventory space but doesn't make it unlimited. The GBA version does what it can with the hardware. Visuals are similar enough, and it does introduce the character portraits when someone is speaking. These are a great addition that gives characters a bit more personality than small sprites can. On the audio front, like its predecessor, the soundtrack suffers from the hardware. For content, it adds the Soul of Rebirth, while changing a few things on the interfaces. Items no longer need to be equipped for use in battle, you can just use them straight from the inventory. Some bugs, including the infamous action cancel bug, have also been removed from this version. The PSP version merges Dawn of Souls content and gameplay, plus a little more, with the Origins soundtrack while sprucing up the visuals. The smartphone versions use this as their base, using many of the same touch interfaces from the first game. This does bring the same problems of scaling to larger screens, and bugs are also present, but with both of these issues, reports seem less severe. This may be down to Final Fantasy II as a whole being less popular though, and it is easy to see why. Let's wrap this up. Final Fantasy II has problems. It may be debatable as to how bad they are, and I certainly appreciate the fact that the developers tried new things. Many of the ideas went on to become series staples, and even those that didn't return aren't bad in concept. Like I said earlier, the game suffers more from poor execution than it does poor ideas. Alas, that poor execution does have an effect. Far too often, Final Fantasy II left me bored, almost asleep on a couple of occasions. The necessity, and worse, the method of grinding, do not lend themselves to an engaging experience. Neither does 10 floors of the same dungeon aesthetic while being bombarded by encounters. The story is a big highlight. It's far from the series' best, maybe not even in the top 10, but it is still a huge leap above the first game. And if you keep in mind this story was originally on an 8-bit system, you should come out of the experience fairly satisfied. Is the whole game worth your time? On balance, I would say Final Fantasy II is for the hardcore only. If the gameplay and levelling, despite its flaws, sounds interesting to you, then you may want to check it out, especially if you have lots of patience for grinding. If you're into games for the story, this is worth it as an early example, though you may want to look for a guide on the easiest character builds and find maps so that you don't get tortured by the monster closets. If you're more middle of the road or a somewhat casual player who is just looking for something new to play, I wouldn't recommend it. Unless you have very specific tastes that can override other concerns, then you may find there to be too many frustrations in this game. As for recommended version, I'm once again going to say PSP. The Famicom version is obviously Japan exclusive, so you'd need to get a Famicom, get it working and understand Japanese. Fan translations do exist, though there is no way to play these legitimately. The Origins version has the action cancel bug if you want to have fun with that, and comes on a disc with Final Fantasy I, but beyond inventory limits is effectively the same game. So, if you want to experience the game close to its original form, this is the best option. Similarly, on the GBA, Final Fantasy II is packaged with one and includes the bonus story. Beyond that, it has little to recommend it. In almost all ways, it is outclassed by the PSP release. The PSP has the best sound and graphics, and the most content, once again making it the best option. While the smartphone versions are the easiest to access, the bugs and lack of post-release support are genuine problems. That was Final Fantasy II. Quite the leap forward, but not the most graceful of landings. After the stumbling, which features would linger, and which would be dropped? Next time we look at the final 8-bit outing, the game that remained absent from the West for 16 years after its Japanese release in 1990. You guessed it, we'll cover Final Fantasy III from the top.